Everyone, to another edition of The Travel Show with your host, Ted Blank of Ted Blank Luxury Travel and Adventure. And as we enjoy doing, we love to talk about all things travel with Ted. And I can't wait to hear what our topic is. How have you been?
I've been doing well, thank you. I think the last time we talked, I was in Brazil,
Yes,
wasn't
and I have to tell you, it was a great connection being that far away.
On Wi-Fi on a ship.
What the heck?
But we were actually on a Starlink satellite connection. So Elon Musk's Starlink, that was what connected us.
Amazing.
I know, amazing. But it is amazing how much better internet technology has gotten. Well, connections and connectivity.
For
and
sure.
Cruise ships in particular, they used to have like dial-up speed internet, and they've gotten much, much better now.
So I know that you actually were trying to take a real vacation, but people could in fact work on a trip like this if they wanted
Certainly.
to.
Absolutely. There are a lot of travel advisors who work remotely 100% of the time. So you could certainly do that.
Well, let's talk about being a travel advisor. What's that like?
Yeah, I would say there are two questions that people ask me most frequently.
Oh.
And number one, as you can imagine, is where are you going next? And number two is, what does it take to be a travel advisor? And so I think that's a great topic to talk about.
Well, I do too, because I would assume that is really changed over the years.
It has, and that's an excellent point. You know, if you think back to the age of the Main Street retail travel agency back in the 1960s
There used to be one
and
up
the 1970s,
in the mall here. Yeah.
There were several in Hastings,
You could
like
walk
3 or
in.
4.
Yep.
Yeah, and you would walk in, and basically someone would take your order.
You'd look at a brochure.
You could look at a brochure,
And
but a lot of it was selling airline tickets.
Yes.
And, you know, people would come in and they would order an airline ticket and they would hand you some paper and off you'd go.
Like it had different copies, too.
Different copies. Remember the red ink that would
Of course I
always
do.
smudge on
Of
your
course I
paper?
do.
Yeah. So back in those days, you know, it was very much an order-taking business. It was about understanding which buttons on a computer system to press. That's what travel agents really learned.
Because we couldn't do a lot of it
You
ourselves.
couldn't do it yourself. It was impossible. There was no way to do it. And so over time, the industry has evolved, and it's really evolved to make some of the transactions can be done on a self-service basis. And so the industry has really shifted away from a order-taking, pushing buttons type of a job to a more consultative role.
For sure.
And so that's really changed the way people come into the industry, the way they train in the industry. Back in the day, those people who took those orders probably went to a travel school. And they spent quite a bit of time learning which buttons to press, because these computer systems, you know, these are the old ones where you walked by the computer and, you know, your hair would get blasted away because it was using so much electricity. The fan was running at full speed. You know, it was very complex. The systems were very complex. It was almost like coding to code into a system to get the ticket to appear.
Because otherwise, did we buy our tickets at the airport?
You
I
could
don't
go to the
even
airport,
remember.
or sometimes you could call. But you know, this is even an era when credit cards weren't even widely used. So it's really changed. And so that pathway into the industry where you'd go to a travel school and sort of learn how to code has gone away. And so the modern travel agent, or as we kind of call ourselves now, the modern travel advisor, comes to the industry in a very different way. And the skills that are required, the expertise that's required is totally different. And it's much less about pushing buttons than it is about knowing people, knowing travel companies, travel suppliers, and knowing destinations, and being able to work with clients in a consultative way.
So I really enjoy you because you have so much experience, real world experience. You call it show prep. But I think that's different. In the olden days, I felt like people that you would have help you with a trip, they had never been to any of these places themselves.
And that was certainly possible. And that's actually now, I would say, the number 3 question that people will ask me, or they'll ask my team about. Have you been to this destination? And that's a super common question that people ask of travel.
I think that's a fair
advisors.
question.
Well, I think it's a fair question, but let me give you a little different perspective on it too. So I think, first of all, it's a good question, because it's basically you asking for that particular advisor. You're trying to discern their expertise level in that area. And so to the one hand, I think it's important to go to different destinations and try different trips, different places, and get to understand them. I always like to, though, observe, and I'll always quote from my favorite book detective, Sherlock Holmes, and he had his sidekick, Dr. Watson, and he would always say to Dr. Watson, you see, Watson, but you don't observe. And so I think it's important to not just go someplace, but to actually observe it through your expert eyes. And those expert eyes are a little different than maybe your personal eyes.
For sure.
I could go someplace and have a terrible time, but it might be your idea of an absolute dream vacation. So to be able to separate those two out and to say, okay, what is it that folks might like about this? What is it that folks might not like about this? But to approach it from a data gathering perspective and an observation perspective, as opposed to what did I like and what didn't I like? And I think that question of expertise, I think that question of expertise, I think it's important when people work with a travel advisor, and this is something my team and I do every day, it's to have our clients interview us. And not just give me a list of places you've been, but tell me about you. Tell me about conferences you've gone to. What types of professional development have you done? Start to ask those types of questions beyond just have you been someplace. Because I know a lot of people who've been to any given destination, and they're not necessarily going to be able to give you any insight into it other than, well, I went to Mexico and it was warm.
Sure.
There's so much more to it than that.
Right. It's like asking a waitress, have you had the whatever?
Yeah.
And maybe she likes fish and you don't like fish. And so, yeah.
Yeah. And I think it's great to ask waitresses and waiters, what would you recommend? And I think the good ones will say, I like this because... and they'll give you a rationale for it. Or a lot of people like this because.
Sure.
And I think that's an answer that demonstrates expertise versus, well, I don't like chicken, so I can't tell you about the chicken. Well, that's not really very helpful. And so I think that is a really good question to ask. Have you been there? But beyond that, what is your expertise? And that's where, when we talk about what does it take to be a travel advisor, it's about building that portfolio of expertise for each and every one of us. And in the old days, people used to go to school and they learned from books. And that's not how it works anymore. Travel agents are not licensed. There is no licensing system for travel agents. And so, we've talked a few times about scams that can be out there. And so in a situation like that, there are people who probably don't have any business being travel agents or are doing it for nefarious purposes out there. So there's a little bit of a buyer beware element to it. And so one of the ways we build that expertise and we build that knowledge is through training. And that training can come in a variety of ways. But like any other profession, we have some great professional organizations out there. So kind of a good litmus test, first test right out of the gate if you're looking to build a relationship with a new travel advisor. Are they a member of the American Society of Travel Advisors? That's our professional association. And in order to be a member, you actually have to subscribe to a code of ethics. And you can go to the website, asta.org, asta.org, and you can actually read that code of ethics. And so right away, you're chopping out a big chunk of people who just aren't, maybe they aren't serious enough about it, or they aren't interested enough to even kind of take that very basic step. And then as part of memberships in organizations like ASTA, there are a lot of opportunities for training and for learning. And so my staff, for example, next month, are all going to Vienna, Austria for a conference, an educational conference that's being hosted by ASTA, and it's about river cruises. And so, by the way, I will be at home for that. So I got to go to Brazil, but they all get to go and I'll be at home. So just to make sure we have the playing field level. But they will actually be spending about 10 days living on board a couple different river cruise ships. So instead of staying at a hotel, they're actually staying on board a river cruise ship.
Smart.
They'll probably tour about 20 different ships over the course of the time they're at this expo. Right. And they have 3 days of sort of classroom type learning. And then they're also going to be going on a trip on one of the river cruise lines. So they're going to get a tremendous amount of expertise and knowledge packed into a very short period of time. And all of them have been on river cruises before, but this is an opportunity to really go from being kind of knowledgeable about something to being a real expert. Same thing with Alaska. Everyone on my team has been to Alaska. And when we come back, we don't just share pictures of the great time we had. We actually talk about what went well. What didn't go well? Were there hiccups along the way? What are some things we can tell our clients? Hey, you're going to Juneau. Here are some things you really, really need to know. And so it's a much more subtle way of, I think, building expertise than there used to be in the past. And so that's why I do think it is important for people who are looking to work with a travel advisor to interview them and to ask them questions. Not just have you been there, but great, you've been to France. What did you learn? What do you like? What don't you like? Because we're going to ask those same questions of you, knowing full well that, you maybe aren't as experienced of a traveler, but we want to make sure we understand what you like so that we can apply that expertise. So it's a very different way of learning and growing as a professional than it was back in the day, 20 years ago.
So when you take these classes or seminars, what are some of the topics?
So they will be everything. Some of them will be very specific information about a specific travel company. So pick a brand out there, Princess Cruises or Viking Cruises, to learn and understand what they do, what they offer. You learn a lot about their policies and their procedures. And that's really important, because the average consumer might not understand when they call a cruise line to book something, what are they actually booking, and what didn't they know about when they were booking that? What else was available that they didn't see or that wasn't presented to them? And so you learn about those policies and procedures so that you can help. There are different fares for every cabin. Let's make sure we pick the right one for you. Different cancellation policies, different types of accommodations. So it's kind of product training. It's understanding the specifics of the product. Some of it is destination training. So it's going to be kind of the same thing, only focused on a destination. So for example, I've completed about 12 hours of courses about the country of Switzerland. And so I've learned about every region of Switzerland, transportation and hotels and things to do and different experiences you can have. So I've been to Switzerland as well, but there's no way, unless I had lived there for my whole life, I could ever possibly have learned all these different things. So it's like, okay, well, now I know about in Grindelwald, here are some things that maybe you should think about doing that, maybe you wouldn't have any idea that would be available. So destination training is part of it. And then, training about the business of travel and understanding reservation systems and cancellation policies and payment policies and credit card confidentiality and, some of the not so sexy stuff that goes into operating a business. Real business kind of stuff. There's no requirement that your travel agent have done any of that. And so I think it is really important for consumers, when you're working with a travel advisor, to ask them the questions. Have you completed certifications? Have you completed, if you're planning a trip to Switzerland, have you completed the Swiss travel certification program? If you have, you know a ton about Switzerland. If you haven't, you might know a lot about it, but it's kind of the difference between being a dabbler and an amateur and being a sort of trained professional. So it's a lot of different things. And then, of course, everything changes. And everything has changed since COVID. So it almost feels like, for me, I'm going back and learning everything.
Really?
Again, oh my gosh, so many things have changed, and policies and rules and things like that. And things keep changing. Just in the last month, the Greek island of Santorini put a cap on the number of cruise ship visitors. So they only allow 5,000 cruise ship passengers per day to be there. I think from one perspective, that's great.
Sure.
Because it's going to make for a more pleasant experience when you're there. But there are also a heck of a lot of people who had cruises planned to Santorini now who aren't going to get to go there. And so keeping up on those things and making sure, now when we talk to people, well, the itinerary may say Santorini, but just so you're aware, there is a good possibility that itinerary might change. So keeping current on things like that, and things like travel cautions and passport and visa rules. Just in the last 3 months, the United Kingdom now requires Americans to complete a pre-travel, they call it electronic travel authorization. It's sort of an electronic visa. So making sure our clients know that, making sure we understand what it is that means for people, and when they need to do it and what they need to have in order to do that. So it's constant. It's a profession where you're always learning. And as you mentioned, one of the ways you learn is by traveling and observing, as I like to say, but there's a lot of other things that go on as well.
So do you have an organization that pushes some of these regulations down to you so that you know them, or does each individual advisor have to stay current themselves?
So, our trade associations, and the two biggest ones are ASTA, the American Society of Travel Advisors, and then there's another one called CLIA, which is specific to cruises. They share a lot of that information, and one of their roles is to kind of collate all that and to present it to travel advisors through our daily newsletters and our travel agent magazines and all those types of things, and the conferences that they host where they'll bring people in to talk about these types of things.
But it's up to you to stay on top of that.
It's up to us to stay on top of it. And that's true. That's true for many, many professions. Physicians have continuing medical education. Obviously, there's somebody there with a stick saying, if you don't do that, you're going to lose your job. We don't have anybody there with a stick, but I think pretty quickly a consumer would realize if they're working with a travel advisor who is professional and keeps up on that, or they're not.
What are some of the pitfalls if we don't work with somebody that's buttoned up?
So I would actually say one of the biggest pitfalls in travel is booking directly with a supplier, meaning that instead of booking your cruise through a travel advisor, you book it through the cruise line. And I will tell you, first of all, that you will lose out on a variety of different amenities that are available to you on many, many cruises, but you are also essentially at the mercy of that cruise line. You don't have anybody who understands what other cruise lines do. How might they approach a similar situation if there's a problem? You're stuck with a toll-free number. I have a Rolodex of people that I can talk to at different cruise lines when there are problems. Can't always fix things. I had some folks, unfortunately, who took a cruise to Norway in January, and they got stuck in port for 5 days because of really, really bad weather. Not much I can do there, but I can work and help and make sure that the compensation they get for that is the maximum compensation that's available to them. So I think that's probably the first mistake, is to book directly with a cruise line or a tour operator or someone like that. And if you have a problem, it's you're one booking versus that entire company. Well, my company, the company I'm affiliated with, Travel Leaders, we put a heck of a lot of people on those cruises. And so we probably have a little more pull with them than you would have individually. So I think that's probably the first problem folks can encounter if they do things themselves. I think the second one is just not knowing what else is available.
For sure.
And being able to have somebody say, you're thinking about this, but think about this as well. I had a client that I spoke to on Monday of this week, and they are planning a trip to the Canadian Rockies, to Banff and Lake Louise and Jasper. And he didn't realize that there had been fires up there, huge fires up there last year. And he wasn't aware of the option to take a luxury tour train that you and I have talked about called the Rocky Mountaineer. Maybe he'd heard about it, but it wasn't really in his top of his mind. And I happen to know it's the perfect fit for him. They love being taken care of. They love riding on trains. They love good food. And I said, hey, let's plan this trip up, but let's make sure we include this. And, they were thrilled. They're like, yep, this is exactly what we're looking for. I had no idea this was even available. So I think you miss a heck of a lot. And that's hard to quantify because, when you go shopping for something and you buy something, in some ways you're satisfied, right? Because you purchased something. But a lot of times I think we realize after we purchase something, we get that kind of buyer's remorse.
We didn't check around.
We didn't check around. We didn't maybe get the best option. And so a good travel advisor can really help you not miss those things that exist that you just don't know about.
Ted, such great advice always. If people would like to really sit down and chat more about this, how could they go about doing that?
Yeah, so you can give me a call, 651-964-8245, and my team and I are happy to make an appointment with you, either in person or via Zoom or on the phone. Or if you're up in Hudson, Wisconsin, we're at 206 Locust Street, 10 to 2, Monday through Thursday. You're welcome to stop in or visit our website, tedblanktravel.com.
Great information. Thank you so much. And this show is called The Travel Show with your host, Ted Blank of Ted Blank Luxury Travel and Adventure.